Well, thank you everyone for coming. This is the first in a 7-part series that we're putting on at the Harvard Kennedy School called Can the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict Be Resolved? It's along the same lines as a series that have been carried out in the past, including last year there was an Israeli member of Knesset, Ophir Knespaz, who also looked at this question in an in-depth way. And I'm hoping through this 7-part series that we can begin to look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in a much more in-depth way than is currently reflected either in common discourse, in media, and so on and so forth. The series is going to today's the first event. We're going to also have our second event on this coming Monday, featuring Paul Guerin, who worked in the Gaza Strip, is going to focus on some of the problems that the Gaza Strip is currently facing and the Hamas-Fatah reconciliation, if that's at all possible. At the end of the month, we're also going to have another session, and we've got some confirmed speakers who include Yoram Maital, Rob, who we have here today, Rob Malley, and among others, and and Carmen Nabulsi. I'm very pleased today to have this be our launching session, our first session. And before I introduce Randa, who is a friend, I also wanted you to note that the day after tomorrow, on March the 1st, there is also going to be a session on Palestinian refugees. Filippo Grande, who's the Commissioner General of UNRWA, is coming to Harvard and will be speaking at the Weatherhead Center on Thursday from 4 to 6 p.m. And so I encourage you to attend that as well. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Randa Farah. Randa is a professor at the University of Western Ontario. She's done a lot of work on the issue of Palestinian refugees, and most of her research is actually focused on this issue. And today she's going to be speaking to us and giving us some insight about Palestinian refugees, opinion, and the Palestinian national struggle, particularly with some historical reflections, but also focusing on current date. So thank you very much and welcome, Randa.
Thank you. Okay. Thanks, of course, to Diana and Noel and everybody who made this possible. It's really a privilege for me to be here and to share with you my work as well as my experiences. I want you to be a bit patient with me because I tend to speak fast. So to speak slowly means that I might go a little bit long, not too long, but and also I want to say that this topic is so huge and so vast and so has so many trajectories and branches and so on. So at the risk of simplification and generalization, I thought to discuss the Palestinian refugee issue within the larger historical shifts. I'll be reading because I tend to go off in tangents in arabesque fashion. So I'm going to focus to maximize on the time available. So I'd like to discuss it within the larger historical shifts and political scaffolding, especially as it relates to Zionism and the national project. Revisiting history is significant, but it is not an endeavor to recreate a pristine past or to withdraw to a preceding era in order to evade confronting present realities. Rather, learning from the past and about the past is necessary to negotiate our present, and more critically to redirect our collective vision and steer our practices and towards the future. As Edward Said so rightly and eloquently said, what one remembers of the past and how one remembers it determines how one sees the future. Although the question about alternative strategies and the future vision should emerge out of collective popular participation and debate, subordinate classes and the poor, including most refugees, have been marginalized and at multiple levels. Even in oral history projects aimed at recording the memories of a dying generation, and notwithstanding their critical importance, refugees are treated as archives of memory and not as subjects of history. We plunder and excavate their memory for information we deem important. We sift through their stories for facts and forget that all facts and historical events are mediated by subjects. Rather than following a strictly chronological sequence, I have opted to move back and forth between temporal and geopolitical spaces, between individual and collective histories, and from the micro to the macro levels as interfacing fields. I entwine anthropological research material, scholarly sources, and because of its relevance to this topic, I have also incorporated a little of my own trajectory. In a manner of speaking, it is more of a collage than a classical narrative construction. I was born and raised in Haifa 7 years after Israel had been established. In 1965, my family crossed the Mandelbaum Gate into the West Bank. We had hardly settled and began to breathe differently in the Israel-free environment when 2 years later the Israeli military occupied the West Bank and Gaza, along with other Arab territories. So once again, we became occupied natives and confronted Israeli tanks, checkpoints, and military rule. Upon graduating from high school in Jerusalem, I left to study first in Beirut for a couple of years and then in the US. I returned to Lebanon in the late 70s, where my parents had relocated. But fate is wily. In 1982, a few years after we settled in Beirut, Israel invaded Lebanon. This is when our friends with a good sense of humor urged us to stay put and not move again. Yeah, some said maybe go to Saudi Arabia, but that was like dark humor. I mentioned this as a way to talk about different phases of the Palestinian dispossession, displacement, and expulsion. The first phase coincides with my childhood in Haifa. Around 150,000 of us who survived the ethnic cleansing in 1948 became second or third class citizens in Israel. 25% became internally displaced, or to use the Orwellian Israeli legal fiction, present absentees, which enabled the Israeli state to confiscate their lands and possessions as well. Israel imposed military rule on us alone, since its inception and until 1966. This implied, for example, that our movement was restricted and we needed permits to travel. I shudder to think what my parents' generation must have felt when standing in front of an Israeli officer, most likely a new settler from Europe, to plead for permission to move in a land that they and their ancestors had freely traversed for centuries. Military rule prevented us from forming political parties, from having our political publications, from studying our history in schools, and we were discriminated against in employment and other spheres of life. Although physically we had not left Palestine, the political nexus around us shifted radically, and in manner of speaking, we were exiled in situ in our own homeland. On a personal level, it meant that Yossi, the new Yemeni Jewish neighbor, could yell at the top of his voice, calling me a dirty Arab, as if it was something I deserve and should expect. As a child, that always puzzled me, because frequently when I passed Yossi's house, I could smell the aromas of shish kebab and Arabic food. Israel obviously was unable to completely erase his Arab or Oriental background. I also remember quite vividly that there were expansive areas of Palestine we could not access. No signs were necessary. We understood that these were delineated for Jews only, such as kibbutzim. Needless to say, the boundaries were not always and everywhere as rigid or mutually exclusive, especially in cities like Haifa. But in general, the incongruous colonial topography characterized the landscape of my childhood. The second phase begins in 1965, the year we crossed into the West Bank. This is the period when the PLO emerged, when Israel occupied the remaining areas of Palestine, and when Jamal Abdel Nasser died. A memorable day and a sudden end of a long era, during which many hoped he would liberate Palestine and unify the Arab world. By the time I graduated from high school in Jerusalem in 1971, most of the PLO cadres evicted from Jordan had re-established their bases in Lebanon, and this is also when I left to study in Beirut. In those good old days, Beirut, the beautiful Mediterranean city with its seductive coastal contours and cedar mountains, throbbed with political life. Its urban landscape was unlike any other in its ability to accommodate the myriads of political, social, and cultural trends. Beirut's coffee houses, marketplaces, mixed neighborhoods, streets and alleyways, hotels and brothels, universities and refugee camps were interlocked in impossible contradictions and paradoxes that only Beirut could embrace. This was the heyday of freedom fighters, or fidaiyin. Politics seeped into everyday conversation as nationalists, Marxists, and others debated and argued on university campuses and joined protests in the streets. All Palestinian men and women, wearied by decades of exile and longing to their homes, were reawakened from their sorrows and trauma of 1948. The mood was secular, and the winds of decolonization and self-determination had swept the region and the Third World. The presence of Fidaiyin signaled that the Palestinian refugees refused to disappear in the Arab world, as the Zionist movement had hoped. Indeed, the right of return was the access and the central creed of the PLO's recruitment efforts. Notwithstanding diverse factional politics, the PLO enhanced the sense of peoplehood and granted us a unified political voice. I left Lebanon to continue my studies abroad for 5 years, and by the time I returned in the late 70s, the fires of the civil war ignited in 75 were still sweltering and portending of a darker storm. And the storm did arrive in 1982, carrying Israeli deadly arsenal. I was a mother of a 6-month-old baby. The images and smells of human carnage are deeply etched in my memory. I must admit I was not very brave back then. I felt helpless. How could anyone protect babies when vast areas of Lebanon were blasted from land, air, and sea? Lethal American weapons, including cluster bombs, left some 20,000 to 30,000 dead, and many more injured and displaced. But no one was prepared for what was to unfold in Sabra and Shatila refugee camps, when in September of that year, a pre-planned and cold-blooded massacre managed and aided by the Israeli occupying force and executed by the Lebanese right-wing ally slaughtered everyone in sight. In 1984, I left Lebanon to return to the region a decade later at the end of 1994, a year after the Declaration of Principles, or Oslo, had been signed, to conduct research in the refugee camps of Jordan. But speaking about this history to Western audiences is never easy. How and where does one begin to talk about a people maligned or at best invisible and absented from consciousness except as an impediment to peace, as a pitiful or violent people? What spaces are there to re-narrate the history and predicament of this ancient and uninvented people? To publicly exhibit the Palestinian land of oranges, of olives, of ports, and flourishing urban centers that once pulsated with life. This always calls for a Promethean endeavor, for there is no easy way to undo Orientalist and Zionist misrepresentations maliciously propagated that Palestine, for example, was barren and empty except for a few roaming Bedouins, or that the Palestinians willingly abandoned their Palestine, or that we plan to throw Jews into the sea, although of course it was the Zionists who in reality threw us into the sea and desert. And our history proves our Andalusian legacy of coexistence or convivencia. Even more cynically, that the very act of speaking about Palestine is by some perverted logic anti-Semitic. Our voices are like cacophonous and barely audible notes yearning to be heard amidst the deafening sounds of distortions, lies, and dissonant associations. One of those is the linkage made between the Holocaust on the one hand and the consequences of the Zionist project on the Palestinians on the other, as if the latter was an unavoidable and even in the Western imperial worldview a morally affordable outcome of the former. Thus, attempts never cease to stifle our voices, to overwhelm and flatten our stories like our homes, streets, and lives. If we don't need to recall our ancestors, including the Canaanites, the Philistines, Hebrews, Assyrians, Persians, Egyptians, Greeks, Romans, Arabs, we can perhaps begin in the 1920s, when Palestinians were debating what color they could use for their flag to adorn their state, which they thought was about to arise from the old and weary Ottoman Empire. For a while, they considered the color orange, symbolizing their famous Jaffa oranges. Back then, the glimmer of independence began to shine in the horizons of the region, albeit on borders carved by colonial powers. But in Palestine, it was swiftly snuffed by a signature to a letter known as the Balfour Declaration of 1917. The letter, surreptitiously incorporated by the League of Nations into the Articles of the British Mandate in Palestine, promised European Zionists that the British government would do its utmost to help them establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine. This act was a contravention of the League of Nations 1919 covenant itself, not to mention that the British mandate was merely the euphemism for imperial domination. But the legacy of the Balfour Declaration outlived the setting of the empire's sun, leaving behind it an unfulfilled promise of self-determination affirmed by the UN in 1960 in Resolution 1514. Preparation and implementation of the Zionist project to build a Jewish state occurred with British approval, protection, and support, a role passed on to the new American power after World War II. Thus arose the Jewish state on the debris of Palestinian society. Armed violence and terror tactics cleansed the majority of the indigenous inhabitants. Bulldozers erased some 500 villages from the landscape. Palestinian private and public property was plundered. The land was expropriated and the new settlers literally moved into our homes and harvested the fruits of our erstwhile lands and labor. To grant what was seized by military force a legal facade, the nascent state passed a series of laws with two main objectives: to thwart attempts by Palestinians to return and ensure that the Jewish are the majority at all times, and to prevent the Palestinian refugees from repossessing their lands and properties. In the meantime, the international community, which today calls for repatriation as the most privileged, durable solution for refugees, turns impotent and the laws freeze when the refugees are the Palestinians. But the Israeli legal edifice is constantly being refined to produce legal fatwas and enable it to swallow the little that remains of Palestinian land, and maintain Jewishness as the basis and ethos of its state. Taysir Khatib is today fighting against an Israeli fatwa so he can live in Akka or Acre with his wife Lana and their two children who are threatened with deportation. January of this year, the Israeli Supreme Court upheld the citizenship and entry into Israel law, which severely restricts Palestinian Arab citizens of Israel from living together in Israel with their Palestinian spouses from the occupied Palestinian territory and so-called enemy states, which includes, of course, you should know them, the axis of evil, Syria, Lebanon, Iran, Iraq, and they forgot, I think, North Korea. They should have added that. So Taysir's family, like Palestinian refugees, threaten Israel's social purity and demographic ratios and arithmetic. Although the Zionist project had the markings of classical colonialism, it is distinguished by specific features, among them that there was no metropole, nor an Israeli state prior to 1948. The whole state project had to be concocted and meshed together from diverse and scattered institutions and communities. Forging a nation, or as in Shlomo Sand's term, inventing a Jewish people, represented a complicated challenge, since Judaism, despite intellectual ramblings to the contrary, remains fundamentally a religious affiliation. There were Moroccan, Yemeni, Iraqi, Ethiopian, Russian, German, Polish, or Polish Jews who had little in common besides their religious background. Although unlike Jews who have lived in the Arab world, European Jews have also shared a history of persecution. This point becomes clearer when Fawz al-Asmar, a noted Palestinian scholar and poet, asked, "Who is a Jewish atheist?" Israel did not and still does not recognize an Israeli nationality, has no internationally recognized borders and no constitution. Not all citizens are equal under the law, only Jews are deserving of full rights. The effects of these underpinnings were detrimental to Palestinians who abruptly became refugees in 1947 and since. The emphasis on the Jewishness of the state meant that Zionists could unabashedly claim that the right of return of Palestinian refugees threatens its Jewish character. So it came to be that in 1947-1948, a once coherent society formed and enriched by the influences of many civilizations was abruptly dispossessed and dispersed. Around 750,000 were uprooted. Some fled to the West Bank and Gaza. Others sought refuge in Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. When in 1967, Israel occupied the remaining 22% of Palestine, approximately 400,000 Palestinians were displaced, around half of them for the second time. Displacement, whether within or outside of historical Palestine, has become a central feature of the ongoing Palestinian saga. Within Palestine, through deportations, land expropriation, settlement expansion, home and camp demolitions, walls and fences, withdrawal of residency rights, especially in Jerusalem, blockades and military assaults, the most recent and brutal on Gaza. For those on the outside, political and armed conflicts in the region caused further displacement. For example, in Jordan in 1971, in Lebanon during the civil war and the Israeli invasion, and from Gulf countries and Iraq as a consequence of the two U.S. invasions. Although the Arab League formalized principles for the treatment of Palestinian refugees in 1965 in the Casablanca Protocol, which theoretically granted refugees rights in the fields of travel and employment, the status of refugees in Arab countries was largely contingent or hinged on their political context and fluctuations. For example, during Nasser's era, refugees in Egypt fared relatively well compared to the Sadat era and subsequently. In Lebanon, Palestinian refugees encountered discrimination and repression from 48 to 69, when the Cairo Agreement was signed. Thus, they enjoyed relative freedoms until the agreement was abrogated in 1987. Since then, and notwithstanding some positive changes in the laws in 2010, most of the around 400,000 refugees live in squalid and overpopulated camps, are poor, underemployed, unemployed, and still banned from a number of professions. Although Jordan granted Palestinian refugees citizenship and nationality rights, they remain vulnerable to discrimination. For example, they were negatively affected by the Jordanization policies in the 80s, which favored employing native Transjordanians in the public sector. Or, for example, in July 1988, when the late King Hussein renounced claims to the West Bank, many Palestinians lost their residency and other rights, and many continue until today to be denationalized. In general, Syria granted Palestinian refugees economic and social rights denied them in countries like Lebanon or Egypt. However, the refugees living in the West Bank, and especially in Gaza, are particularly vulnerable. As Richard Falk once observed, as a result of the absence of international protection, one of the largest and most severely abused refugee communities in the world finds itself in a situation of legal and political vulnerability. They are left unprotected, particularly victimized by Israeli policies of closure and blockade that prevent those in camps from gainful employment, etc., etc. It's important to emphasize that the predicament of the Palestinian refugees is an Israeli responsibility. While refugees struggle for rights in various host states, the blame should not be transferred to them. Someone who commits a crime should not be granted pardon because his neighbor mistreats his victim. But trying to push the Palestinian refugees onto the Arab world is an old Zionist aim and strategy that precedes the establishment of the Israeli state. An excellent source on the numerous pre-1948 and subsequent Israeli plans to integrate refugees in the Arab world may be found in Noor Masalha's book, The Politics of Denial. Israeli policies to encourage refugees to melt, fade away in the Arab world provide the platform of the more recent Israeli attacks on UNRWA. In the last few months, Dani Ayalon, Israeli foreign minister, has been posting a series of videos on YouTube under the title Explanations of Historical Facts. When you hear an Israeli official talk about facts, you can safely change it to its antonym: fiction, falsehood, deception. The series, translated into several languages, was produced by a PR firm in collaboration with Stand With Us, a right-wing US-based group that tries to promote Israel's image. His most recent video is on Palestinian refugees, in which he proposes that UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, should be dismantled, blaming it for prolonging the refugee issue and the conflict, and suggesting Palestinian refugees be placed under the UNHCR's mandate, which is the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. My response in the article I shared with you is more detailed, but suffice it to say here that it seems that the Israelis have not read the 1951 convention that calls for voluntary repatriation, or that UNRWA exists only because of Israel's systematic rejection of the Palestinian right of return, or the Israelis have come to realize that UNRWA has failed to act as a catalyst to integrate refugees in the Arab world or mute their political and legal struggles. Ayalon also neglects the fact that, unlike UNHCR, UNRWA has a humanitarian, not a protection mandate. I have a better suggestion for Ayalon. Speak truthfully, acknowledge your responsibility in creating the refugee problem, abide by international law on the right of return, and finally dismantle birthright and all the programs that seek to lure Jews and grant them citizenship in Israel, even when they have no prior historical attachment or connection to the land, while the indigenous people and their descendants are barred from returning. At the end of 2011, the total Palestinian population was estimated at 11.2 million. Approximately half are within historical Palestine, the other half are in exile. Yet 70% of the total population worldwide are displaced, inside and outside. In 2008, there were, for example, 6.6 million refugees and over 400,000 IDPs, which is internally displaced persons. 1948 refugees and their descendants constitute the largest group of refugees. Now, the figure for UNRWA-registered refugees, a segment of the total refugee population, is around 5 million. Of those, 1.5 million live in 58 refugee camps dispersed around the region. Jordan is the largest host of refugees outside Palestine, and wherein almost 2 million UNRWA-registered refugees reside. The figures are powerful indicators that tell us that 2 out of 5 refugees in the world are Palestinians. However, statistical aggregates, despite their many uses, smother what is behind them. They tell us little about real people, their histories or everyday struggles. Official classifications and humanitarian labeling, which emanate from dominant political and ideological orders, have the potential to do the same. In the Palestinian case, the many categories describing the displaced population contribute to the fissures within society, especially in the context of a weakened leadership and political malaise. But then came the Oslo Agreements in 1993, like a shattering tremor that caused a dramatic shift and divide in national politics. This was the context that provided the impetus for my research with Palestinian refugees. I wanted to find out how they reposition themselves and how they narrate their histories in such a radically transformed context. A number of intellectuals, scholars, and activists who had joined in the Oslo jubilations at the time and accused some of us who opposed it as romantic and idealistic have since reversed their position. Today, there is copious literature on the ruinous effects of Oslo and the so-called peace process. Therefore, I will return to my research and follow its ramifications on the ground. In late 1994, I packed my bags and left for Jordan, where I stayed until 2001, with the exception of 1 year abroad. I listened and learned from Palestinian refugees as they recounted their life histories, interpreted historical events, and expressed their aspirations. One story followed another about villages of origin, so vividly narrated that many used the present tense. But in the early years following Oslo, anxieties ran high, and anger and shock at what they regarded as a perfidy or a perfidious event or signature. As Tariq, a refugee from Al-Baqa camp, stated, "The PLO leadership manipulated our sentiments and the ideals of our people in the camps. They used us as fodder because they knew that we are the ones that are willing to die for our land." Refugees were aware that the Oslo agreements, about which they were never consulted, intentionally omitted the UN General Assembly Resolution 194, which provides for the right of return. They watched many former cadres and leaders replace their freedom fighter outfits with suits to fit their work as bureaucrats within PA institutions. The process that gave birth to the PA symbolized the radical transformation of a national liberation movement to a local chiefdom managing administrative native affairs for the colonial masters. One of its consequences was the deepening of divisions, such as between 1948 refugees and 67 displaced, between an outside and inside, between Gaza and the West Bank. Abu Ahmed, for example, a 1948 refugee from Ajur, near Hebron, displaced to Jordan for the second time in 67, observed, "We, the people of 1948, they forgot about us completely. Now they are demanding something for the 1967 people. We wish them well. As for us 1948 refugees, we do not want war or anything. We just want our lands back." Abu Ahmed was not an exception. I heard many similar expressions that spoke of us 48 and them 67. The late Abu Adil, a refugee from the village of Saris, now called ironically Shorish Forest, who played a significant role in fighting against the British mandatory authorities in the 1930s and the Zionist armed incursions, was ill and lay on a tattered mattress on a cold floor when I interviewed him. Enraged by the agreements, he was more forthright, and his words in today's context are kind of prophetic. We need a long time before we can return. We need to liberate the Arab spirit first. It must be free. As for Arafat and all those with Arafat and all those that serve Arafat, they have betrayed us. The West, they know about us, the Arabs, what helps us advance and what keeps us backward. They, meaning the West, the US, encourage us to fight each other. Walking through the camps during one of my first visits, I couldn't but notice the squalid conditions, the dilapidated infrastructure and the smell of open sewage, which hung in the air. I passed by children playing on the narrow streets or near disposal bins, or rushing out of school buildings, looking very relieved that their first or second shift was over. Women sat together, some sifting through lentils spread on trays or picking bluchiyeh leaves to prepare the affordable and popular dish. Some older men sat by the doorstep or walked around the camp to escape the suffocating shelters, driven out by the memory of the open spaces of village lands, memories which lurked like inescapable companions in exile, reminding them of how they had lived and what had become of them. I finally arrived at Samia's home, a small structure built by family members, friends, and neighbors using cement, which had replaced the asbestos shack and the original tent. The house resembled most other refugee shelters. The paint on the walls was peeling. The walls themselves seemed uneven and cracked. The tiny kitchen with a small and old oven was tucked at the back, had nothing much but for a few covered glass pots and pans. The rooms had a few second-hand pieces of furniture and some decorative items. These hung together as if to summarize the family's history itself, and inseparable history joined to the collective trauma, such as a picture of the family's martyr, a picture of Jerusalem displaying the Dome of the Rock, the Palestinian flag, diplomas and certificates, Palestinian embroidery, and a framed Quranic verse. I would never have guessed from the dialect or dress that Samia's mother was originally from an Egyptian village called Ain Shams. Samia's father had met his wife in the 30s while hiding in Egypt from the British authorities, who had crushed with merciless brutality the Palestinian rebellion. I was especially eager to meet him. I had heard a great deal about Abu Khalid from his son and how he had spent most of his life in the resistance movement and many years as a political prisoner. Finally, Abu Khalid appeared, and for a fleeting moment I thought I was looking at a peasant in a Van Gogh painting, an appearance which masked his hardiness and political wit. He was already in his late 70s and quite ill when I met him. He passed away some years ago, but like Abu Adil and many others, their names do not appear in professional or official histories. In another house, I recorded in Mustafa's life history while sitting on the roof where some goats lazily bathed in the April sun. Both the goats and I, or so I imagine, gazed at the distant hills surrounding the refugee camp. Back in 1970-71, Jordanian military tanks were stationed on the top of these hills and bombarded Palestinian bases and refugee camps. The armed conflict, also known as Black September, marked a turning point in Jordanian-Palestinian relations. For refugees, it only confirmed that they would never feel secure except in their homeland. My thoughts were confirmed by Mustafa's remark. She said, Jordan fought against us, and she named many other countries. And in the 70s, they took my son to prison. So I went looking for him. I said to the prison guard, listen to me, you imprisoned my son, but do you think I will keep quiet about this? She was quite angry and livid. Back then, I called the refugee shelters hesitant structures. Children born in camps explained that their parents did not want to build with more durable materials. They had strongly believed they would return soon. As a matter of principle, they also wanted to tell the world their existence is temporary and they did not wish to strike roots anywhere except back in Palestine. Younger generations realize the struggle will be a protracted one, so they attempt to improve on their socio-economic status. But they hasten to add that such improvements should not be interpreted as a sign that they have consented to resettlement. Rather, they distinguish between livelihood needs and their political stance. Refugees call their homes numra or wahde, literally meaning number or unit. It connotes and represents or symbolizes UNRWA's conceptions of ordering and homogenizing space. To qualify for one, each male household had registered as a refugee, the definition of which was primarily operational for the agency's purposes. The ration card, Kart al-Mu'an, which allowed them access to UNRWA's various educational, social, and health services, acquired various meanings over time. Especially in the first few destitute years, the popular saying was, "We have no one in this world except God and the ration card." However, as is the case with UNRWA itself, the card crystallized paradoxes and was deemed both a blessing to secure basic needs and a curse that reminds them of the loss of land and dignity. In those early years, UNRWA inscribed the camp as a humanitarian space. But while it registered and labeled refugees, the refugees challenged its humanitarian discourse. For example, in schools when teachers taught students about their past and by the incessant retelling of stories about villages of origin. This contradiction pertains to beginnings and the questions of identity. UNRWA was born after the Nakba. Its very existence and historical legacy begins when Palestinians became refugees. Clients whose identity as far as the agency was concerned was as beneficiaries. As for the refugees, their beginning is in Palestine, predating UNRWA, and they identify themselves as part of an exiled nation, not as beneficiaries. In the life histories of the first generation, the camp appeared as a temporary space, representing the antithesis of a permanent village. And whereas their expulsion was abrupt, becoming refugees, presupposed a struggle for independent living. For the second generation born and raised in camps, UNRWA figures more clearly as a central institution that permeated their habitus. As children in UNRWA shelters and in camp neighborhoods, they heard stories about their villages of origin and the Nakba. Thus, each child could connect his or her present to a particular past and a future in a specific place in Palestine. But they also remember lining up for long hours to collect rations and the unforgettable daily march to school wearing oversized plastic boots, which they shared with several other siblings, wading through muddy puddles and alleyways into bitterly cold tents and barracks used as classrooms. Thus, by the time the PLO emerged, the younger generation had become aware of their historical plight and political rights. It was the convergence of these two factors that transformed the humanitarian labels and spaces into political symbols. The tent became the emblem of the struggle to return, and the school for education to redeem families from poverty and the nation from occupation. The following verses, widely disseminated among refugees, then exemplify the spirit of the period. It says, translated literally, "Ignite the fire in the tents and throw away the ration cards. No peace and no surrender until we liberate Palestine." Class issues, social class issues, during this period were encompassed or encapsulated within the nation, and poverty was conceptualized in moral terms, such as it molds a human being, or it is the poor who carry the nation's burden. But the peace agreements threatened to strip away these symbols that the refugees granted. Hanan, a young woman, insisted, "The word camp means takhim, camping, which means that one day we will return. We will destroy the tents and return. Can you imagine there are plans," she said to me, "to erase the word camp?" Like gusts of wind which have frequently blown over the camps, political changes and official agreements leave their traces. In 2007, I made a research visit to Jordan, including refugee camps. The fissures, especially between Fatah and Hamas, had produced dispersed cantons and diverse referential points for the struggle. By then, political Islam posed as a serious contender to the PLO, whose unifying umbrella had practically, if not theoretically, collapsed. The mood was somber. On one occasion, I visited a family living in a camp in Az-Zarqa, and the first thing that struck me was that an entire wall in the grandfather's home was painted with green trees, a planted field, and a blue river. Years earlier, as I soon found out, he had commissioned a painter to draw a scene from Bisan, his original village. The grandfather began to tell me the heartbreaking love story between him and his village, a story he had told his children and grandchildren many times over the years. But he had hardly begun when his eyes swelled and he fell silent. He couldn't bear the thought that at his age he probably would never see his Bisan before he dies. He reminded me of the many refugees I had interviewed who expressed a wish to be buried in the soil of their villages. In earlier years, the grandfather also published a booklet about Bisan, a practice which had increased since, as if the passage of time provoked an urgency to document these memories lest they fade away into oblivion. But neither generational nor geographic distance has made the Palestinians disappear. Samir, a young man born and raised in Al-Baqa camp, stated, "We will pass on to our children not only what our parents told us about the oranges of Palestine, but we will pass on the memory of the camp and how the camp became a symbol of Palestine." Today, there are numerous community-based organizations all over the world advocating for the right of return, and new technologies have enabled oral histories to be recorded and disseminated globally. These new global solidarities contrast sharply with what is today an anachronistic discourse on the peace process, the two-state solution, etc. With each Israeli violation, the ghost of the ethnic cleansing in 1948 reappears amplified, bearing multiple pasts into a condensed present. And the hope of return is rekindled, mobilizing new generations of refugees and exiles. Abu Basel from the camp, Baqa camp, made this clear. He said, "Younger generations ask us, why did you leave Palestine? We tell them we didn't leave. We were forced to leave. There was war and death. We did everything we could. But now you have grown. You became aware that you have land, a grove, and olive trees. Let us see what you will do." The Palestinian national leadership has failed to provide a model for liberation or harness national consent, to use a Gramscian term, around the vision and nature of the future society. In fact, even prior to achieving self-determination and independence, it fell into the same pitfalls which Fanon attributed to post-colonial states. The assumption of positions of power by the elite, whose interests diverge from the rest of the nation. Secondly, as powerful elites, they become entangled with the former colonial power, tying the nation to new kinds of colonialisms. It is rather a historical irony that, contrary to other decolonization cases in the Third World, metaphorically speaking, that the emergence of a Palestinian authority dethroned the nation instead of crowning it. It is important to remember that in the 70s, the idea of the mini-state was declared at the time as a stepping stone to a one-state or one democratic state. Later, the mini-state became the ultimate end, or the maxi-state, which pushed the history of expulsion in 1948 into the Israeli arena of non-negotiable facts. And now the PA is scrambling for the state of Bantustan, the little bits that don't even form a bite. Another major pitfall has been a focus on Palestinian patriotism with less attention to regional struggles against imperial domination. The Israeli state is part of this larger imperial regime, a striking hand to quell attempts at economic and political independence of the Arab area, or the Arab world. Although today the uprisings are throwing the ancien regime, the shape of the new polities to come are still unclear. I'm almost done. The right of return carries the potential for a liberationist ideology. It contrasts with the exclusivism inherent in the concept of the Jewish state. The idea that those belonging to a nation state should be constituted by people who share the same ethnic, religious, or cultural background resulted in a dreadful purification scene in World War I, where those considered different others were denationalized and cast out as outsiders. They became refugees, forced to wander the continent. In countries defeated in World War I, the idea metamorphosed into fascism, with little tolerance to those deemed inferior and subhuman. Jews, the Roma, the disabled, political dissidents, and communists, culminating in the Holocaust, one of Europe's darkest chapters. We should ask what exactly is meant by the Jewish character of the state that Zionists seek to preserve. Despite the obvious racism in the idea that Palestinian Muslims, Christians, or others will tarnish the purity of the Jewish state, we may still ask, which character exactly? Is it the cultural preferences of Yosef, my childhood Yemeni neighbor, the Falasha Jews from Ethiopia, the Russian Jews, the Orthodox Jews, or secular Israelis? The right of return and decolonization are inseparable processes, a project that requires us to consider the nature of the future polity. However, regardless of its shape and form, it must be a model of inclusion and diversity, which incorporates Muslims, Christians, Jews, Druze, atheists, and people of diverse backgrounds. Palestinian rights do not and should not generate another calamity and a counter process of Jewish displacement. The actual modalities and mechanisms to accommodate the right of return are not impossible to achieve, even though at this historical juncture it seems so far-fetched. A growing number of studies, including, for example, Salman Abu Sitta's work, shows that a Palestinian right of return is not only just but is also viable. However, the onus remains on Israel to confront the past and take responsibility for the Palestinian calamity. The repercussions of Zionism have been disastrous not only for Palestinians and the region, but for Israeli citizens whose lives have been shaped by a state preoccupied since its inception with military superiority and aggression, and with the relentless fortification of the bastions of Zionist colonial outposts and settlements. In time, Israeli society will turn into a prisoner of its own making against democratic forces and processes that military might and segregation walls will be incapable of halting. I will end by an excerpt from Edward Said, who said, "But what is more important is the question of responsibility. I think it should be in the consciousness and conscience of every Israeli that this state obliterated the Arab life of pre-1948. That Jaffa was formerly an Arab city from which the Arabs were expelled. And I think Israelis should be aware that their presence in many places in the country entails the loss of a Palestinian family, the demolition of a house, the destruction of a village. In my mind, it is your duty to find out about it. Many Israelis resist this because they think the consequence should be to leave. Not at all. As I told you, I'm against that. That is the last thing I want to do, is to perpetuate this process by which one distortion leads to another." Thank you.
Thank you.